Hello and welcome to the Flourishing Introvert Talks with me, Jo Rawbone. This is the podcast that celebrates the natural gifts of introverts so that we can flourish in all situations. Episode 246, Powerful Storytelling for Introverts. In the autumn of 1987, I sat at my kitchen table nervously preparing for a really important, to me anyway, job interview the following day. My heart was beating a little too fast and I'd practiced my presentation to the kitchen window several times, and the only audience was my cat Chumley. He wasn't much help. I've always been one for preparing, and I think that's partly the engineer and partly the introvert in me. To fail to prepare is to prepare to fail, as the saying goes, and I believe that with my whole being. However, the extent of my preparation that evening and in the days before made me realise just how much I wanted that job. During the process, I learned one of the many lessons that stays with me to this day, and this particular lesson was one about me. I learned that if I want something badly enough, if my heart is set on a particular outcome, there's nothing that's too much trouble, and I become pretty much unstoppable. There was another, possibly more important lesson that emerged from the whole interview process though. And that is, if I want to engage people so they feel drawn to listen to me, I need to be good at storytelling. So in this episode, I'll be sharing why and how storytelling helps introverts connect with those they're communicating with. After all, if you've ever been interrupted in a meeting or had your very valid and relevant point seemingly dismissed, chances are you didn't have the attention of the listeners. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. That's how the stories of my childhood started, and it's still a very good place to start. Although the story I opened this episode with was about me, using story is a way we introverts can share our ideas, experiences, and emotions with more confidence. How? Well, the story that we craft doesn't need to be about us necessarily. It can be about an unknown person and from a third party's perspective, but it does need to be relevant to the situation or the problem being discussed. In that way, we can remove ourselves from the limelight if that's helpful. The good news is that storytelling is one of the oldest and most universal forms of communication. There isn't a society on earth that doesn't tell or hasn't told stories. Whether it's passing on ethical and moral lessons, family legends or local knowledge, stories are front and centre. And yet how quickly we also taint that with the negative connotation of someone dodgy telling stories, i.e. fibbing, spinning a yarn or massaging the truth. Just to be clear, that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about using stories and examples in order to connect emotionally and make a point. One of the ways that I find stories help is that they help me to parallel process and make sense of my bit of the world. As someone is telling their story, I often have a me too moment, which helps me to feel seen and heard whilst enabling me to gain more clarity. I've attended a few trainings about storytelling over the years, and I think it was Bernadette Jiwa who taught me that a good story tells, a great story engages, a good story informs, a great story moves people, a good story chronicles events, a great story invests people in the outcome. A good story changes how we think. A great story changes how we feel and what we do. We all already have a good story to tell, and it's how we tell it that makes it great. Now, it's a good thing that I like planning and preparation because, as Donald Miller says, good stories don't happen by accident. And thinking back on what Bernadette Giwa said, neither do great ones. This means that our stories need to have a clear structure, in the most simplistic terms, a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is as opposed to a rambling story that just meanders and leads nowhere. The former has the power to engage, whilst the latter will have people reaching for their smart devices in order to distract themselves. The most popular and widely used story structure in books and movies is this. A character has a problem, they meet a guide or mentor who gives them a plan to follow. The character follows the plan, takes action, which will either lead to success or failure. I invite you to think back over your favourite movie or book plot, and I bet you'll recognise that structure. Me? Well, in 2015, my mum died, meaning I was now an adult orphan. I felt at a wretched crossroads in my life, and I knew I had some big decisions to make. Retire? Nah, not ready yet. Carry on as before with my respected training and coaching business that I'd been running since 1994? Yes, and that wasn't quite enough for me anymore. Or find my real purpose in life and incorporate that into my already successful business. Now we're talking. Coincidentally, at that exact same time, my friend Ali recommended a new women's business mastermind called Empress, and I leapt at the chance, although it was eye-wateringly expensive. I'd never invested that much in myself and my business before, but I knew that these were special circumstances that demanded special action. So I bit the bullet and went all in. I almost immediately had my doubts when, on the first 3-day workshop in Paris, an American influencer who was a special guest speaker asked me to create my BFD statement. Some of you have heard this before, but I had, and still have, a very visceral reaction to this, as I'm not a big effing deal, and had no intention of becoming one either. But luckily, I gelled really well with one of my fellow participants, Linda, and she quickly became my mentor and my dear friend. It was when I was working with Linda during and after that mastermind that Flourishing Introverts was born. We co-created the model that covered the 2 things I knew I had to address. Firstly, how I help mid-career introverts, typically in STEM careers, who are frustrated at being overlooked and undervalued. They know they have more to offer and are tired of pretending in order to fit in and get on. And secondly, how I enable organisations to recognise and shift the extroversion bias embedded in their everyday practices and processes. During and after the creation process, I felt excited and just a little terrified as I now knew the direction I was headed. And as I was managing this alongside my busy traditional corporate practice, I accepted that it was going to be slow going at first. But hey, we hear all the time how apparent overnight successes are actually quite a few years in the making. I could be patient. Now, you might be surprised to know that this felt like a big gamble for me. I have a very busy training and coaching business through which I've never talked about my introversion before. It's not that I was ashamed of it, but I knew the negative connotations that still surrounded introversion at that time, and I was worried whether my clients would stay with me. It wasn't like I was executing a dramatic pivot from one direction to another. I was aiming to integrate my passion with my purpose for the first time, and this was a big deal. So I knew the stakes were high, and I knew just how much I wanted to make it work. Actually, I had to make it work because my reputation somewhat depended on it. And here I am, several years later, a TEDx speaker on my topic with a community of followers who tell me they are benefiting from my work. Why do I tell you all of this? Well, partly to demonstrate how this universal structure depicts real life, and partly because if you listen through to the end of my own story, at various times you will have felt something that had you go, "Me too," or "Go you," or "Yuck," or "Not in a million years." Whatever it was for you, you connected emotionally with my story in some way. That's the power of storytelling. So far, I've shared 2 different stories, each with a different structure. So as you've seen, using storytelling to enhance how your message lands needn't be complicated. These are some of the things that I need to consider before I start writing or crafting a message, which I thought I'd share with you as they'll help you get started too. Our love of preparation and our think before we speak communication style means we can quickly become naturals. I've included just 5 points here. 1. Why might a story work? There are times when people just want to get straight to the facts, but actually, how much do facts really engage people? Number 2, what's your desired outcome? This shapes the type of story and its arc. Number 3, who are your audience? Language matters and can make or break audience engagement. Number 4, how do I want my audience to feel? Using evocative language helps a lot with that. And finally, number 5, what's the star moment, the something they'll always remember, or the teachable moment? There are very natural opportunities where story is effective, including in a presentation. Let's face it, it's much more engaging than death by PowerPoint. Delivering training where you want people to understand the impact of taking action or not. Writing a book or an article where you want people to continue reading. When introducing myself and networking, so much better than the name, job title, company routine. In fact, I intentionally use a story approach in my live shows, when writing my weekly reflections email, because it's a story of significant events during my week, and where appropriate when I'm creating my fortnightly Flourishing Nudge newsletter for LinkedIn. So next time you watch, listen or read something from the House of Flourishing Introverts, notice the story, notice how you felt, and see if you picked up the teachable moment. Whilst learning is an active process, we can still pick up a lot through ambient learning. So as you get attuned, you're subconsciously starting to master your own storytelling craft. Oh, and in case you're wondering, I got that job I was preparing for back in 1987. It was for my first job as a business skills trainer as my employer launched their Total Quality Management initiative. Despite my initial fears and nervousness about whether my quiet and measured self could really be an inspirational and effective trainer, I can't imagine doing anything else now. It's been over 37 years, thousands of delegates across tens of countries, and my passion for my profession has only grown. So when you choose to do things that are out of the ordinary, that maybe you even think initially aren't for you given your quieter nature, give it a go and be prepared to have your life changed for the better. Nothing changes unless we do. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, then please subscribe, rate us and leave a comment, because we know that that helps other people find the podcast. And if other people find us, other introverts can flourish.
You are listening to an Intentional Media Production podcast.